anybody else forgets. That'll be fantastic. Okay, welcome everyone to the UCT Map the System semi-finals. We're excited to have you here. It's been a really long journey, especially for the teams that had registered at the beginning of the year or perhaps even last year. So we're really excited to have you here. And Rowan, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the second time since we've been hosting Map the Systems at the Bertha Centre that we're actually doing an event for our semi-final competition. So that's really exciting for us. Rowan and I have been working on this for the better part of a couple of months. We've walked this journey with the 26 teams that initially entered right at the beginning. So we're really excited to have the 4 teams this evening that are going to be presenting for us. And I just wanted to welcome everybody from the Bertha Centre, our colleagues, stakeholders from the community. Also like to welcome anybody else coming from South Africa or anywhere else outside of South Africa. I think this is exciting. I think one of the team members is actually based in Canada who's going to be presenting. So I think we have a really nice spread and representation. As you guys know, tonight we'll be selecting the team that'll go on to represent UCT at the global finals for Map the System 2021. Because of the pandemic, the team that will be selected will not be going on to Oxford as we usually have it, but they will be participating virtually. So for us, that's really exciting. And we're hoping that this year, the team that we select will be able to go on into like the finals of the Oxford Map the System competition and actually present as one of the top 6 teams. And I think that the presentations and the teams that we have here this evening are actually really, really strong. And as you'll see from the presentations and what they've put together, that we have quite an amazing set of teams. So just to touch base on what will be happening this evening, I'm going to hand over to Rowan shortly, who will introduce the 4 teams that are participating, and they're going to go on to present. So each team will have about 15 minutes to present, but that also includes the judges' Q&A. So I think it's actually just under 10, and Rowan will be managing that session. And then we're going to be joined by our guest speaker, Lauren Hermanas from How We Adapt. So she'll be joining us after the judges have actually moved out of this room to go and deliberate and select the winning team. And just before Lauren kicks off her talk, we're actually going to have a poll where you, the audience, will select a team that'll be awarded the Audience Award. So that's a team that you really feel like presented really well and that they really deserve to be recognized and given kudos for the presentation that they've put together and the work that the team has done to actually give us a wonderful presentation. So before I hand over to Rowan, I think I have to thank our judges who have been involved in this process with us for the last couple of weeks. Our judges are the team that's going to select the team that ultimately goes on to represent UCT at the global finals. We're joined by 5 amazing judges, and for the Bertha Centre community, you might recognize some of these judges because they're part of either our team or our community. And Precious, I'm hoping that it's up on the screen now, but I just want to give brief kudos to those judges and just read out their bios, because I think we have an amazing set of individuals who really represent a diversity of sectors. And I want to start off by introducing Tuba Mzila. So actually, Tuba's been with the Map the System competition for a while. He entered in 2019, and he's actually been a judge. I think this might be your 2nd or 3rd year, Tuba. So welcome again. It's lovely to have you. Tuba is a past UCT PGDA student who completed his course here at UCT in 2019. He also competed in the Map the System final in that year. During his time at UCT, he served as Vice President of InvestSoc and was also a strategic thinking tutor. He's currently completing his articles at Investec in Johannesburg. Our 2nd judge is Shanaz Munshi. Shanaz is an HPSR researcher, occupational therapist, and Emerging Voice 2018 fellow, as well as a senior Atlantic fellow for health equity at Degano, based here in Cape Town. Shanaz is currently the project manager for the Shahim Family WITS program on social determinants of health and health equity at the School of Public Health at the University of the Witwatersrand. She also serves on the steering committee of the People's Health Movement. We're also joined by Zach Essa. Zach's team actually won the competition last year for the UCT leg of the finals and went on to represent the institution at the global finals. Zach is a consultant for the Innovative Finance team here at the Bertha Centre, so still part of our community. And Zach previously worked with Papa Masedi in Cape Town, where he supported the development of entrepreneurs based in townships across South Africa, across Cape Town. And in 2019, As I mentioned, Zach and his team represented UCT at the Oxford Map the System competition. Our second last judge is Fergus Turner. Fergus is a program manager and senior advisor at the Bertha Centre. Fergus also manages Bertha Centre's scholarship program. He holds a master's in inclusive innovation studies at the Graduate School of Business, where he focused on action research in the cultural sector and creative economies. Fergus also holds an honors degree in human geography and a bachelor's specializing in political science and public policy and administration. Prior to joining the Bertha Centre, Fergus worked for consulting firms looking at risk management, organizational strategy, and stakeholder engagement in investigative journalism and event organizing. And finally, we're joined by Ncitisa Ngonyeni. Ncitisa is currently the director at Bertha House, but importantly, Ncitisa was previously the Social Systems Innovation Lead here at the Bertha Centre last year. She convened the Systems Change Executive Education course and led the Africa Regional Hub of the Global Systems Play team, which was a support and resource node for systems innovators pursuing sustainable development goals. Ncitisa is deeply curious about what happens at the intersection of social justice and systems thinking, and she has a particular interest in the potential for counter-narratives to shift the values and beliefs that uphold unjust systems. Ncitisa is deeply curious about what happens at the intersection of social justice and systems thinking, with a particular interest in the potential for counter-narratives to shift the values and beliefs that uphold unjust systems. So I do want to say thank you on behalf of the Bertha Centre, Rowan and myself. Thank you to the judges who've been involved in this process, who are going to be basically selecting the winning team for this evening. So before I hand over to Rowan, just to give you a quick run through again, the teams are going to be presenting now, and then we're going to select the audience award, and then we'll be joined by our guest speaker whilst the judges are deliberating, and then they'll rejoin us again, and then they will announce the winning team. We will also announce the audience award, and then we'll give the judges an opportunity to actually share with us just the context around how they came to that decision, and then we will wrap up for the evening. But for now, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Rowan Spatzoli, who's been working very closely with me on this project, and who's also been working with the judges and the teams to introduce the teams and their topics.
Thank you so much, Kense, and thank you for all of the hard work you and the rest of the team have put into this. Really, really excited for this Map the System finals, and really excited that so many people that can join us on this. So we have 4 teams competing in the finals. We had 26 teams enter the competition, and these are the 4 teams that have made it all the way to the finals, and I'm so excited to hear from them. They're incredible teams. Some of the teams have actually come together for the first time for this competition. They met as part of the competition, which is really exciting for me and for our team. To talk about just the 4 teams that will be presenting and the order they will be presenting in. Team 1 is called the Cape Town Inclusives, consisting of Lolita, Samuel, and Diane, and they will be presenting an inclusive urban development in Cape Town. Team 2 is the Disruptors, consisting of Delisha, Deboho, and Michaela, and they're looking at high rates of unemployment in South Africa, South African rural and township regions. Team 3 is called Amatebo, consisting of Mama Lema, Maxwell, and Anati, and they're looking at utilizing a tiered model to explore healthcare inequality in rural South Africa. And then Team 4 is the Gamers, and the Gamers consist of Robin, Benin, Raymond, Lawrence, and Douglas. Their topic is called Snakes and Barriers, and they're looking at addressing the imbalance in the representation of African culture in the global video gaming industry. So really, really incredible topics for this. And then just to reiterate the rules, in a minute or so, we're going to start off with the first presentation. I'm going to ask them to come forward. So that'll be the Cape Town Inclusives in about a minute. Just a warning for you guys. And the way we're going to be running this is that each team will have 10 minutes to present. I will unmute myself just to notify you when there's 2 minutes remaining. And we're going to be very strict with the 10 minutes just for the purposes of time. Once the 10 minutes are up, there'll be 5 minutes for the judges to ask questions. I'll keep time for that as well. So yeah, so in total, each team will have 15 minutes, 10 minutes to present, and 5 minutes for questions. And then as soon as all 4 teams have finished up, the judges and I will go into a different room, virtual room, obviously. And I'm going to sit with the judges, and the judges are going to decide what the winning team is. Then we're going to have a guest talk at the same time, which I'm incredibly excited about. And Kense will introduce our guest speaker then. And then we're going to come back and award the audience favorite as voted for by this wonderful audience. And then we're going to award the team that will receive, the winning team from the regional final, that will receive 10,000 Rand of funding to further their idea, as well as represent us at the Oxford finals in a couple of months' time. So yeah, that's the order of events. And I'd like to call forward Lolita and Samuel, who will be presenting on behalf of Cape Town Inclusives. Can you unmute and share yourselves and start sharing your screen? And when we're ready, we can get going. Fantastic. I can see your screen, Sam. Are you ready, Sam?
I'm ready, but Lolita, that's you sharing the screen, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Fantastic. It's up on screen. I'm going to count you in, and I'm going to start then. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good luck.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sam Foss, and I'm part of Team Inclusive Cape Town. And Lolita and I will be presenting to you tonight. Abdul Dayan can't make it tonight because he's observing a religious ceremony. But we are super excited tonight to share with you the insights that we've gained as we went through this very interesting process. So I want to kick us off tonight by asking, what comes up in your mind when someone says to you, let's go for holiday in Cape Town? Perhaps you think of some of those amazing restaurants that Cape Town is known for. Or you picture this mountain and you think, wonderful, I'm going to be hiking in beautiful scenery, perhaps go to a winelands. Perhaps you even think of the beautiful Atlantic seaboard and all that pristine beaches that you can get to enjoy. Truly, if someone says to you, we're going to Cape Town, I often see this look of envy in people that are not here. It's like a gift that someone has given us. And as we look at that, we realize, let's unwrap that gift and see what the real Cape Town is like. When we go into the real Cape Town, we discover that how we've just pictured it is not how many people experience it. We see these kinds of scenes as shown on our screen, where people have inadequate housing. They crammed together with no space, no social distancing, and no privacy. There's poor ablutions and no running water. That bucket in that room is the bucket in which you will wee tonight and again tomorrow morning before you get to empty your bucket into a public toilet that is shared by hundreds of people. The reality is, as we unwrap Cape Town, we are actually left with a burning question. The burning question is this: how do we make our city more inclusive? Because that excitement that we feel is not experienced. And so this is what we gave ourselves to. We looked at how to make an inclusive city. And this map shows you the fruits of our labor. I'm going to be handing over now to Lolita, who will take you through some of the aspects of what we've discovered.
So we discovered that Cape Town is actually a very fragile city. And what this means is that the services aren't adequate for the citizens. And this usually happens because there's just not enough funding. So this idea was very true to us, and we found how it makes sense when we look at our city. And when we see, for example, how tensions between local and national government negatively affect the availability of government funding, which in turn then negatively affects the ability to provide basic services like electricity, sanitation, housing, all the things that you just saw Sam mention. And so we found that this lack of provision this lack of providing basic services results in people, in citizens, starting to make alternative arrangements. And the alternative arrangements are positive or negative. So I've listed 3 arrangements right in the corner here. These are more positive responses that try to fill a gap that is not there, that's not being filled. And gangs and gated communities, you might be surprised that we've grouped these together, but we actually think that these are very negative responses that make our city more fragile. And if you just look at the picture on the right, you can see how unequal and unjust this is. You can see that people are responding in exclusive ways. Only privileged, you have to have certain privileges to be able to physically remove yourself from these lack of services. And another interesting cycle we found that we see in our city is that the lack of provision of basic services results in these injustices being experienced on a daily basis. And ultimately, people start to lose their self-confidence, they start to lose their self-esteem, and they participate less in public discourses. Similarly, we have a very destructive leadership cycle, a leadership that doesn't take ownership, that doesn't listen to feedback of its citizens, and instead adopts a blame culture. So these are all things that make people not see a point in participating, and they start to opt for more violent feedback mechanisms. And we see this in protests, and one can almost use the number of protests in a city as a barometer for a city's fragility, because when people protest, there is something that is clearly wrong. Over to you, Sam.
So what we saw is there are attempts to try and make our city more inclusive, to combat this fragility. But things are complex. Whenever you look at this, some of the things that we can highlight is the tension between should government funding be invested to make our city more economically successful? In other words, should it invest in business, or should it invest in what public research tells us makes a city more inclusive, which is these public spaces like Greenpoint Park and things like that? And you get this conflicting tension and demands on the fiscus. Equally, we see in our city great disparity between the access to technology. And so some will say to make a city inclusive, you need to give everyone equal access to technology. But interestingly, in Africa, there is this concept of a smart African city that does not depend on digital to share information, but instead depends on human systems. So these are challenging things. And we all know that it's very difficult to get national government, being an ANC government, and local government, being a DA government, to just agree to work together seamlessly. So we are almost left with this despair, thinking, can this ever be changed? But we are so encouraged, and Lolita will talk about it a little bit more, that twinning in an African style through community action networks can actually show us that this is not a lost cause.
Exactly, and we're aware that we're dealing with a very complex and difficult to solve challenge. But as we went through this mapping process, we started to see some things that we could start doing to move towards a more inclusive city. And one of the things we found was just appreciating our city's history more and placing more value in culture, and that this can actually help us make better decisions. So for example, in neighborhoods like Salt River, if we were to have more plaques that acknowledge the history of that neighborhood, what happened for it to exist as it does today, we could see that decisions will be better informed, because people are not ignoring history, but they're actually aware and responding to it and see a point in preserving it.
2 minutes.
We came up with this idea of innovative gentrification, and I know it might sound like a complete contradiction, but we actually thought we have to think creatively with the challenges that we sit with. And if we had legislation, for example, that would actually see a need to protect social assets in a community and prioritize human heritage, we could reverse some of these processes that are excluding people and in a way eradicating and eroding history. So we learned a lot of lessons along the way, and one of the key ones was that participation is necessary. It is fundamental for a city to be inclusive. And we saw how CANS during COVID, during a time of shock, how citizens actually took agency and got together and responded to this problem. So we see it as possible. We see we can work with the networks we've created that CANS have presented and build on that to cope with our fragility better.
And so, ladies and gentlemen, as we close, we see that our city is fragile, as we see these samples of alternate arrangements springing up, or we see the very negative stuff of violent feedback mechanisms, rioting coming up. These are all evidence that our city is not as inclusive as we'd like to be. But beautifully, we also see that it is possible to change this. These bad exclusion of people exist merely because we allow it to exist. If we follow the classic example that CANS has given us, we believe we can make our city a place where everyone is excited to live in it. I thank you.
Thank you so much, team. I'm going to give a round of applause there. You actually made it perfectly within your 10 minutes. That was really great. We now have 5 minutes that's going to be available. I encourage the judges to start asking questions.
Thanks for your presentation, guys. I also particularly enjoyed looking at your systems map. Is really well detailed. A question that came up while I was reading it, and I think for our listeners who've tuned in today, I think it would also just be great for you to just highlight what the twinning actually is and how it works. And from my side, I'd love to know where you guys have actually seen this happening in and around Cape Town, particularly with the way that Cape Town is structured. You know, I imagine twinning to actually be a difficult way to go about looking into the future. So I think just kind of break that down for us, where you've seen it work, and then also what you'd hope to see, or how you'd hope to see it implemented in the future.
So I'll jump in.
Yes, go for it. I'll add on if need be.
Wonderful. So twinning is an idea that our research showed us is a great way to make a city more inclusive, but we are seeing it's very challenging to make it work on formal twinning mechanisms. Like internationally, a city in England will twin with a city in Europe, and basically they'll be able to share resources and have good stuff. Cape Town, for instance, is twinned with New York. I don't know if you know that, but what we are finding what we are advocating for is, in fact, this informal twinning, where, for instance, in Capricorn Park in Muizenberg, there is Lakeside right next to Capricorn Park, and they've set up a very innovative mechanism to register unemployed people from Capricorn Park to work in Lakeside. And there's a beautiful twinning program that works. CANS is also an informal twinning process where, as people form a CAN and they reach out to people that are in distress, like we saw during COVID, they are then actively breaking down this animosity between rich and poor neighborhoods. So we feel that there are examples of twinning that can make our city more inclusive, but it needs to be much more amplified and encouraged.
Yes, on a larger scale, exactly. And I think that what we learned also from this pandemic, because our problems didn't just go away, they actually increased. And so I think there's so much power in the fact that it was ordinary citizens in our neighborhoods. I was also part of the CAN, and we then were able, money was put together, for example, to assist people who weren't able to buy groceries, or I went shopping for an elderly also in my neighborhood. And so I think it just shows that it's these big ideas, but when they're broken down and when people come together with a vision, it is possible to deal and to find ways to solve these problems.
Perfect, thank you.
Fantastic. Zach, I see your hand was raised as one of the judges to speak. And Dizzy, you can go next.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Cool. Just my side, Samuel and Lily said that was such a compelling and relevant presentation. So well done on that. So my question is focused on, you mentioned at one point when you were describing the problem landscape that political tensions have led to a lack of funding. I do want to find out from you, I know that provincial allocation falls on the local, whoever's in charge, so schools, housing, etc., etc. What do you think that the relationship is between underfunding and a misallocation of funding? And I see in your systems map itself, it says that participation in public discourse is really important. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the role of NGOs like Ground Up, etc., in creating a more inclusive Cape Town. Thank you.
Sam, would you like to do the first and I'll address the second one?
Sure. I think there's so many aspects to the question that you raise. I think wherever you see the NGOs popping up, it is a direct response because they recognize that there's inadequate service provision from the state. And so if you see the big blue bubble on the right, is where the service provision should happen. But if it doesn't happen, then citizens make alternate arrangements. And the first form of that is a NGO that pops up to then create more services. So we see NGOs play a crucial part to address lack of service provision and actually improve it. But then also to, as that services improve, then probably the motivation to set up more NGOs declines.
We've got one more minute for questions.
You can see from the NGOs, there's a link up to availability of government funding. And the challenge is when there is lack of government funding, be that through corruption or other tensions, you can see both the corruption and the tension influence affecting the amount of government funding. As government funding reduces, NGOs get less money to provide services as well. So it is such a complex thing. So when we see this provincial and local government fighting over money or struggling to work out whose mandate is it to solve a problem, you end up with less money being available or it's being spent poorly.
Mm. And just to respond to the second part, I know we're under time pressure, but independent media is a super important part of how things are communicated in the city. And we were working with limited time. So of course, this map there's so much that we still can add and still need to add. And organizations like Ground Up are they're basically an example of how transparency is supposed to work. And we're supposed to hold our city and our governing bodies accountable. And Ground Up is a great example of how that is done through journalism.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, guys. I'm going to have to cut off just because of time. Fergus and Letiza, you might have to ask your question over chat if possible, or we'll just have to move on to the next thing. Sam and Lolita, thank you so much for your presentation. That was really, really, really wonderful. And I'm really looking forward to see what further work comes of your research. Our next team up is the Disruptors, looking at the high rates of unemployment in South Africa, rural and township regions. And we'll present it to us by team lead Delisha. So Dee, when you're ready, you can turn on your camera, and if you've got a presentation to share, you can share that as well. I'll just give you a second for that to come up. Dee, are you there? Ah, there we go. It's the screen sharing started. Okay, we can see your screen. We can't hear you yet, though.
Thank you.
There we go. We can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. There we go. We can hear you.
Awesome. How's it, Rowan? Thank you so much.
I can't you in as well.
Sorry?
I'm just going to count you in. So I'm going to say 3, 2, 1, go for it.
Okay. Thanks, Rowan. Thanks for having us. Really excited to be in this space. It's an awesome opportunity. Like Rowan said, our team's name is the Disruptors, and we are looking at unemployment in the rural and township areas of South Africa. Our main focus area was, or lever of change that were curious about, was social entrepreneurship, education, and venture incubation potentials, and what that looks like within the South African economy. Our team was made up of three team players. Tebogo Maneli, which is currently a teacher for Oxbridge programs. She has an Oxford University background. She's also the founder and CEO of The Calling, which is a consultancy that looks at social justice, social entrepreneurship, and entrepreneurial development. She's got a background at Wits as well, with when she did her teaching education. Michaela is a content and digital creator. She's a social entrepreneur and a freelance entrepreneurial consultant as well. I myself have a higher education background and a background within the global citizenship realm, as well as sustainability consulting. The two other fellow teammates are on the call, but won't be presenting today. And yeah, so today we're going to be speaking on the unemployment and the ways in which we've navigated a journey of understanding social entrepreneurs, the systems around that, what unemployment is, and what that looks like within South Africa. We've chosen to look at this particularly because we're curious about the emerging market context, and also looking at the ability for us to become an Afrocentric or Pan-African kind of focused system. We looked at our entire process and kind of adapted our model through a iceberg concept, which is something that is used to explain a process that takes place where you can't really see the underlying facets of what is happening. One of the things that we often mistake as consultants as solutions are just throwing out random answers. And I think the beauty of the iceberg model was really just being able to understand what are the more intricate factors that are at play when we look at the unemployment within the rural and township areas of South Africa. At the top of it, we see 7.2 million people are unemployed. And what comes beyond that, or what comes beneath that rather, are firstly a process of patterns and trends that have been taking place over a period of time. Those kinds of patterns and trends are things like
We've lost your audio briefly.
As well as service delivery and infrastructure. Those are part of the patterns and trends that have been taking place over time within the rural and township regions of South Africa. This happens through private sector limitations. This happens through poor infrastructure from public sector kind of deliverables. And it happens through also our inabilities over the past few years to be able to really integrate a education And what we came to understand was that two of the main things that occur within that space is that although entrepreneurs are present and the township and rural economy brings in 150 billion rand a year to our economy, the ability to scale and to connect to the formal world is limited due to specifically venture support avenues. And we look at things like incubation there, as well as capital and education. Then we also noticed at a structural level things like policy limits that were not even vaguely geared towards inclusion, but were really just focused on how do we build SMEs, which is amazing, and SMEs have an awesome contribution. But one of the things that kept coming up in that space was, although SMEs, have a great potential and do have awesome turnover revenue turnovers, we still are left with large social injustices or inequities. And I think policy very much limits, firstly, SMEs, and then also further doesn't really compensate for social entrepreneurship within the policy framework. At the very bottom of what creates this unemployment, or what is seen as creating this at the root level, is actually a psychological kind of challenge or difficulty or tension that's taking place within the system. And that is basically the underlying, or what we reflected on was the underlying belief that starting a business is difficult. So many of these social entrepreneurs or people, even just everyday people that we spoke to, a lot of the research around entrepreneurship concepts were very much, it's a challenging thing to do. We don't know where to access things. We don't even know where to start. We don't have money. So there were a lot of challenges in the mindset of it. And then there was also reflections around the dependency on the state. So we receive state grants, so there isn't a reason to venture outside of that process or model. Beyond that, there were things of, besides the state mentality, there's still a large gap between ANC supporters, for instance, within the political realm, and DA supporters who would rather see their lack of growth and would blame it rather on the political party that's in ruling versus take on an entrepreneurial venture when posed to them as an option. So those are the things that we came to understand when we looked at our research and at the different models that we wanted to understand through social entrepreneurship, particularly education and incubation as a lever for change. Also within the system, what does it mean? We went on to meet a gentleman named Ntokozo Mochwena. He's the owner of the Bread Roll Bakery, which was opened on the 4th of August. He is employed full-time at a coffee company and does this work full-time. He's obviously then ventured out to develop his own one within a township area in Johannesburg called Mamelodi. And some of our team members took a trip out there to go and learn something about his business and try and understand how it is that he understands the world of social entrepreneurship and what it means to have a business for purpose. And so when they came to meet with him, they came to understand that he has, over the past few months, created employment for 5 people in his community. He's upskilled a number of people, just cross-disseminating the knowledge that he's learned within the formal sector. He's been able to do that. He didn't originally call himself a social entrepreneur or look at it that way. It was more so, how does business become something that affects change within his community? And that's what we looked at. That was the lens in which we looked at our entire map through, our entire understanding of the system. We looked at it through his eyes. How did he understand the different components that come together at a primary stakeholder level, as well as a secondary stakeholder level? The stakeholders that were really affecting, or that really were interacting with him when and outside of him as well, because the research reflects back the same thing when we looked at social entrepreneurship. The primary stakeholders that interact when we look at customers, communities, their employees, the investors or financiers, as well as suppliers, very much are based on localizing an economy, very much are based on cross-sharing resources and
2 minutes remaining.
Connecting to spaces like the media and government, etc. And these spaces allow for the social entrepreneur to basically flourish within his space. This is obviously a specific context, but the same applies when we look here at a broader scale. The different stakeholders that interact with him, we identified 4 main stakeholders, not just with the specific social entrepreneur, but many others, which are global trade, government, education institutions, as well as private sector. And these facets in together are able to contribute largely at this point to social entrepreneurship, mainly through education institutions, because they're seen as the major kind of structure that really has access to this knowledge of social entrepreneurship. And they are the main disseminating factors at this point. The ventures that have undertaken the social entrepreneurship kind of model, either through government processes, which are very, very select, have gone on to be able to trade at a global level, as well as increase foreign direct investment. Specifically in the coffee industry, you'd be able to increase coffee trade, which is a huge industry at the moment. And it's one that all of the entrepreneurs that are currently coming up are really exploring as a way of creating employment as well as social justice. All of these things are mapped within our homeland system, a historical context of the spatial divide that still lives out today. And we have to understand that these are contributing factors to the way in which these entrepreneurs exist and of which contribute to the unemployment. It's not just something that happened today. It's something that's historically been ingrained within the spatial divide, within the actual setup of infrastructure and service delivery, as well as education access. So when we understand our Ntokozo and we understand our different social entrepreneurs, we understand them through the lens of interacting with all of these different community stakeholders. Some of our research method looked at different provinces. We looked at Gauteng and the Western Cape, and we looked at different youth, women, as well as township sector and rural sector entrepreneurs to understand this phenomenon. We really came to understand this. Ooh.
You can wrap up with a sentence.
Can I finish my? Okay, that's fine. Can I finish my sentence?
Yes.
And full stop. Thank you, Ro. This came to we just came to understand this through a few of our entrepreneurs, which we see as levers for change. Thanks, Ro.
Thank you so much, Steve. I really enjoyed that, and I especially the organizations you've put up on screen now, the Clothing Bank, our labs, and Yingi, they're phenomenal in the space. I'm going to open up the floor to the judges for our 5 minutes of questions. I'm going to give priority to judges who weren't able to ask in the last round. So judges, please raise a hand if you'd like to ask, and I'll move to you. Fergus, go for it.
Thanks so much, Dilly. Very much clarify further the key. You've taken a sort of somewhat systems little detail regarding the key insights, and perhaps that had to do with some of the slides that were upcoming look like.
Dee, were you able to catch that question?
I didn't catch what he said. Sorry, it was very broken.
That's all right. Fergus, can you ask that again quickly?
That's all right. Fergus, can you ask that again quickly? Just coming in again. I'd take those insights, key levers that have been identified in that space.
Fergus, I think it's both on both of our side. We can't quite hear you properly.
Forward.
If you pop
And
a
that may
message
have
in the
to do
chat,
with the
Fergus, if you could pop a message in the chat, and then I'll ask the question.
Will do.
Thanks, Fergus. Just while we wait for the question to be written up, and I've just paused the time for now on the Q&A timing. But are there any of the judges that would like to ask a question there?
Hi.
Go for it, Nisa.
I'm not sure if this will be a repetition of Fergus's question, so if it is, please forgive me, but yeah, the sound is dipping out on my side. But firstly, thanks to Disha and team for the compelling presentation, and there's clearly a passion for the topic as well, and everyone's appreciation for the topic. So my curiosity was around like the main key learnings that came out for the team in their approach to this challenge. I mean, if you could kind of pinpoint 2 or 3, what would those be?
Some of the learnings that I think we took out that were core themes for us were that social entrepreneurs, both within their experience and within the theory, were passion driven, and the reason for the entrepreneurial venture was very personal to the entrepreneur. They also didn't seem to be accountable to society. They didn't seem to be accountable to anything else but society, as well as focused on their mission solely. They presented opportunities where they circumvented politics because of the business model and being able to privatize the work in which they were doing for social and environmental justice or inclusion. And then the final thing that we really noticed was that they enhanced public and private partnerships. One of the, I think, the main limitations that we noticed was access to the spaces that provide these things, which are mainly our private sectors and our higher education institutions, which we saw as the main kind of tensions within the system. But most of the social entrepreneurs that we saw coming through our labs, through the clothing bank, through all of those spaces, were able to navigate around that because of the adaptability and responsibility to their society and the social kind of personal justice drive that they had behind it.
Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up question? So what would the main leverage point be?
The main leverage point, I think, being able to include social entrepreneurship as a component in everything. So I think being able to understand it as a economic transformation tool in all that we develop, whether it's policy, whether it's how privatization works. I think leveraging it on all of our private global sectors will allow us to create this this kind of business with a purpose, where we're not overusing, but we're using in the space where we're able to share resources and share values and share benefits versus a capitalist system. So that's where I think we'd be able to leverage the most, is being able to create a greater sense of equity using a platform that's mission driven.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ladisa and Dee. I've got Fergus's question. It actually was similar to Ladisa's question in terms of your key learnings, but I think the next part of it is the important one. Well, the thing that hasn't been answered yet is, how might you take this research forward, and what would next steps be?
So I think the way in which we would like to apply this learning is being able to incubate a number of social entrepreneurs who may not even identify as social entrepreneurs, but people that have a particular entrepreneurial and social environmental cause that they're wanting to merge, and be able to look at what those incubation and education processes would hail within those localized communities in the local economy, as well as within public-private partnerships, in responding to social issues with a sustainable kind of economic arm.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dee. So I don't know if there's any other. Oh, Shanaz, would you like to go for it? One of our judges.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? So my question is similar to the previous questions, just in understanding your levers and your main lessons. But I found it really interesting that you used the iceberg model to demonstrate this problem, and a separate stakeholder map. So I was just wondering, in terms of this, the mental models, where would your lever be there? Because I feel like from your presentation, you provided a lot more insight into some of these psychosocial or mental ideas or assumptions that create and enable this problem that you've named. So where would the lever be there? What's your greatest lesson from that angle? Thank you.
Yeah. So I think understanding that it's really just a lack of awareness. And I think the potential lever there, or the potential opportunity is being able to kind of break down what we at a 5% elite get at UCT, GSB, or we get at these levels, be able to break that information down into very everyday context conversations, because when we were able to do that, it brought about a different response to the principles of, being an active participant in social justice, an active participant in the economy, when we were able to bring that language down to a human level, as well as being able to create spaces where it wasn't a distant thing. So space played a big role, like in terms of having to travel. So if the travel was there, it would be seen as not being accessible. So I think being able to explain that, learning doesn't happen at a very far distant place. It can happen anywhere and in any space. Is one of the conversations we've been able to have in that space. Really showed us that it wasn't a absolute no. It was just, and it's awareness that needs to be brought, that these access challenges are maybe not access challenges, but yeah, the potential lever there is really just that people are really willing to learn and really looking for opportunities to grow. It just may seem a little bit challenging at times.
Fantastic, thanks, Dee. And lastly, there's one of your team members has just raised their hands to answer the question, and we're going to wrap up on this project after that. So Tebogo, would you like to unmute and reply to the question?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for that. I wanted to add about the mental lever. I think what Dee was alluding to was about that space, and also the fact that, like, historically, we need to understand the things that create the mental breakdown. If you are confined to a space where you are told the same narrative over and over again, we tend to then have to overcome that. By becoming social entrepreneurs, you are surrounded by people from different backgrounds, and that's inclusion at its core. When we have diverse spaces and diverse people integrating and accounting, so all of these levers for change, all of these social entrepreneur groups that fall under push local ventures, it allows us to break this mental divide, to no longer have that negative self-talk. So each of those programs that are on the slide are labs. You know, they have access to every demographic, women, men, sexualities. It breaks us down into different groups, and that space and that access is amplified. I think our mental condition is at the bottom of the iceberg because it is the most difficult one to get to. So the way we change it is by creating access and conversation in these platforms, not just at a socio-economic standpoint. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tobofo. I know there are some audience questions, but due to time limits, so if there is time at the end of each Q&A session, we will open it up to the audience. But yeah, we're going to move on to the next project now. Thank you so much to the Disruptors for your presentation. It was really, really interesting, and I look forward to hearing about more of the work that you proceed to from here. Next up, Team 3, Amacebo, is going to start presenting. They're presenting on utilizing a tiered model to explore healthcare inequality in rural South Africa. Can I just hear from those participants if you're ready?
Hi, good morning, or good evening. I guess I'm from Canada, so it's actually almost noon here. So I think we're good to go.
Fantastic. I'm going to count you in again, and you have 10 minutes, and you'll have a 2-minute warning towards the end.
Okay.
And in 3, 2, 1, go for it.
Good evening, panelists, guests, and welcome to our system mapping presentation on a tiered approach to mapping healthcare inequities in rural South Africa. We thought it might be helpful to introduce ourselves, so I'll start by introducing Mamalema Malepo, who is a graduate student at the University of Cape Town here in South Africa. Next, we have Anati Jakuja, who is a law student at the University of Witwatersrand, and myself, Max Adams, from McMaster University in Ontario. We will start today by presenting some background information on the issue of healthcare inequity as it relates to healthcare provision in rural South Africa. Next, we'll explain our tiered approach to dealing with healthcare inequity, which consists of 3 tiers. And then we'll explore how these tiers informed our system map. And finally, we'll open the floor to a brief Q&A. So when we're talking about the issue of health inequity, it is helpful to define what we mean when we say health equity, right? Health equity is a situation in which everyone in society has an equal opportunity to live the healthiest life possible. Of course, inequity can and does manifest itself in many ways, and it's often difficult to attain that perfect system. Our goal here is to explore how and where health inequity manifests itself, especially in rural areas. In South Africa, we identified that everyone should have access to basic care, but most specialized care is located in urban areas. And we've also identified that South African healthcare system it's created in a hierarchical fashion. And we've tried to really model our system map in such a way that reflects that. You can see here that the hierarchical fashion with tier 1 and as rural clinics and basic care, things like that. And as we move up the levels through the tiers, the more urban and the healthcare provision gets, making it harder for those in rural areas to access it. So the first tier of our system model here really explores primary problems associated with healthcare provision. So that is a problem that's directly affecting the provision of healthcare, and it manifests at the level of primary care. Secondary problems are those that really arise and often serve as explanatory purposes for why primary problems exist. And finally, tertiary problems are structural in nature, and they influence primary and secondary levels, acting as barriers to providing healthcare in an equitable manner. For the most part, we focused on primary and secondary problems, but we included some discussion of major structural barriers such as lack of trust. Now I'll pass it on to Mamalema to talk about tier 1.
Good evening, everyone. I'll be focusing on tier 1 and how these problems have a direct impact on the provision of quality healthcare in rural South Africa. Firstly, we'll be looking at personnel shortage, where there's a lack of talent in the rural areas, and we find that doctors and nurses prefer towns and cities, which speak to their financial and class standings and prospects. So working in a rural hospital for them is a matter of either deployment and not a matter of choice. We also find that there are material shortages such as a lack of stationery and medical equipment and basic furniture, which then obstructs nurses and doctors from being able to perform their duties effectively when delivering healthcare to citizens in the rural areas. On the next slide, we'll be looking at Gwabeni Clinic, which we can see is in a prefab structure, and it lacks both personnel and material resources. And we also find that such clinics in rural areas tend to close at 4 p.m., which then means that people do not have access to healthcare facilities after 4 p.m. We find that healthcare delivery is thus compromised, and there's a lack of accountability both locally, provincially, and nationally within the Department of Health, and a lack of personnel to operate medical equipment and specialists are also mostly concentrated in urban areas. Moving on to tier 2. In tier 2, we find that the main issue really that affects an entire cohort of problems is a lack of infrastructure. And a lack of infrastructure then affects the supply chain system and has an effect on the geographical distribution of health resources as well. With the lack of proper roads, we find that ambulances are not able to access certain areas. And we also find that because there are no proper roads, the transport systems in many rural areas are thus affected. And because they're not financial hubs, means that taxis and buses are also not frequent. Thus, people have to either wait long hours for them or have to depend on private transport, which they then have to pay quite hefty amounts for, especially if they need to travel at night to a hospital. We also find that this effectively affects when clinics close at 4 p.m. and people need to travel for their healthcare. We find that this causes the health system overload, more especially in the hospitals in towns. Examples of those could be Mankweng Hospital in Turfloop in Limpopo, and which then also causes a problem for those who work within those facilities to have proper access to patient information, and people's files either get lost or people's files get misplaced within the system itself. And moving on to the next slide, we'll then see that negligence by the Department of Roads and Transport and Rural Development and Land Reform and the Development and Economic Development and the Cooperative Governance Department really affects healthcare and ability for people to be able to deliver quality healthcare to rural citizens. In the top right picture there, we'll see that Beginkosi Kulu is working on a gravel road in Mbongolwane in KZN, spreading information about COVID-19, and just how people are spread out and how there's a lack of proper care for the roads there ensures that there's also a lack of proper healthcare delivery. Madibo Hall in the bottom right corner there, the pink hall, the manner in which it is very representative of a number of community halls throughout the entire South Africa. And we find that because these community halls play a very important role in the community and ensuring financial activity and social activity, the inability of the government to be able to look after these spaces also affects the inability to look after hospitals, as we see in the left-hand corner where there's a dilapidated Nessie Knight Hospital and in Kukumbo in the Eastern Cape. And we find that where there's paint peeling off the walls and bricks showing, and even when glass falls out of the windows, and we find that they use corrugated iron sheets in order to be able to block that up. So with the lack of proper care for the facilities as well, it means that doctors and nurses also don't feel comfortable working in such hospitals. And obviously, if the hospitals look like this, then there's a lack of proper medical equipment in those hospitals as well. And in order to be able to try and remedy the situation a bit, we found that certain municipalities then deploy mobile clinics to villages where there's a lack of clinics and where there are many older people that aren't able to travel for their healthcare. But the problem with these mobile clinics is that they do not have all the facilities that one would need, and they are only there for short amounts of times in different villages, as well as they have to move on. And because of the bad structure of the roads, they have to traveling from to and fro the different villages is also a very
I think we've just lost him. If you want to keep going, Anati, go ahead.
Okay, Molweni nonke. I'll be presenting Tier 3. Tier 3 comprises of tertiary problems, also known as structural barriers. Now, as we know, the problems that we have are structural in nature and are influenced by both the primary and secondary problems, as was discussed by my peers, and are a major stumbling block to the provision of healthcare services, particularly to people in rural areas in South Africa who make up 64.7% of the population. Now, a lack of trust in the rural healthcare system emanates from the structural problems that are experienced on an individual and community level, like, for example, intra-provincial migration. Now, with intra-provincial migration, the lack of trust manifests itself in people moving away from rural areas to urban areas. So, for example, this will create a phenomenon of healthcare refugees who overburden the healthcare system in urban areas where people flock. This in turn leads to inefficiency and chaos in those respective areas. An example is a pregnant woman moving away from the rural Eastern Cape to move to an informal settlement in Cape Town, just so that they can be guaranteed that they'll get a higher quality of service when giving birth. If they'd opt to stay in the rural Eastern Cape, they would struggle.
Sorry to cut you off. You can finish up with a sentence if you're able to, or your completing slide.
I'll just take it from here. I think what we've really taken from this experience here is that the issue of healthcare inequity is it's not an easy or simple problem. It's very complex, and there's many things to look at here. The thing here that we really think we need to do is look at the easily targeted primary problems, and obviously there's a lot more work needed for those really structural and explanatory problems as they become very expensive to look into. So we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about this topic. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, team. Sorry about it. I feel so guilty to every time I cut you off, but I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you for that presentation. You guys, that was really, really cool. Judges, if you'd like to raise your hand or unmute to ask the question, you may go for it. Zach has raised his hand. Would you like to go for it, Zach?
Yeah, thanks so much, Rowan. And thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. So you've laid out this really comprehensive and wicked problem about rural health inequity. And based on the complexity of the system, where do you think the best point of entry is, and what sort of solutions do you think could be effective?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Obviously, yes, it's very complex. It's not easy to say, let's solve healthcare inequity. Well, I think the good thing about developing it as this kind of tiered approach is you look at these primary, secondary, primary, secondary, tertiary problems. Is when you're looking at primary problems, often they're, as I said, easily targeted. So, for example, let's say you have a material shortage in a clinic in a rural area. A reason why that might be occurring is because, for example, the inventory system or the management system in which that the employees or the nurses are using to get the proper medicines and equipment into the hospital is inefficient. So there, some training that could be targeting how to use a proper inventory system. New technologies, for example, because right now they're using mostly phones to make those orders. Sometimes that can be problematic. And really looking into ways that you can target those issues. So I think when you're thinking about, okay, what is the first thing that we can do to start solving these problems, is to really look at those that primary level and start looking into, okay, how can we start tackling these one thing at a time? And I think that is the best way to start, because obviously it's much harder to deal with something like poor infrastructure, where it's going to be expensive and time consuming, when you could really be targeting those problems at the primary level.
Fantastic, thank you. Fergus, you've got your hand up next.
Testing, am I coming across loud and clear?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. No, I just wanted to commend the team for really an impressive summary of an incredibly complex issue across different layers and tiers. I just wanted to hear a little more about the relationships between those tiers. In other words, if anybody on the team can share, yes, exactly, share a little bit more, perhaps anecdotally, one particular relationship that perhaps you found in your research that you'd like to share with us to to give us a better sense of how you've been able to, pretty much showcase what those relationships feel like and what they look like on the ground between those different tiers.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I'm a student in business and humanities, so I look at issues related to people. And one of the things that I found was particularly interesting is if you look at the top left here, talent issues. When you think of talent issues, you're thinking of maybe people aren't trained enough, maybe people aren't they don't have the proper skills alignment with what they need to perform the task. One of the things that I found particularly interesting here was the supervision and management of these clinics. Often they're managed off-site. They're not managed by people who are coming into the clinic to actually train the nurses and do that kind of thing. And often they're missing the proper schemes needed to motivate employees. So there's a lot of things there that really result in talent issues. And when we're talking about talent issues, we're not just talking about training. We're not talking about that, but we're talking about things like motivation, feelings of I actually want to be here. I actually want to work here. Things like the being able to actually progress. Like if you work in a rural clinic, your kind of routes for progression are significantly different than those who are in urban hospitals, right? Because you have different places within that hospital to go. Whereas if you're in a prefab shack, or a prefab like clinic unit, you're not actually able to really go anywhere. So I think there's a lot of things here that really demotivate those nurses working in those clinics, and that is one of those things that leads to, for example, a staffing shortage, right? If people don't feel like they can actually move within the system, they will often leave and they'll go elsewhere. So I think that for me was one of the most interesting things.
Thanks very much. That's really helpful.
Sorry, just to add on to what Max was talking about as well, I think also we need to acknowledge the role that the skills drain also plays in rural healthcare being poor. So I think the one thing that government hasn't sort of focused on is really incentivizing highly skilled healthcare workers to go to rural areas. And I think that links up with also just the lack of trust. And yeah, I think it's something that would definitely need to be addressed moving forward. And yeah.
Fantastic, thank you, team. Leticia, I see you have a hand up, but we've run out of time unless it's going to be very, very short.
It's going to be very, very short.
Go for it.
Thanks, Rowan. Hi guys, thank you and well done. My very short question, please could you talk about any feedback loops that you might have identified in your mapping that surprised you, specifically feedback loops?
And a short reply.
And a short reply, yes, please.
Sorry, could you just repeat that again for us, please?
Yeah, I'd like you to talk about any feedback loops that you might have identified in your mapping that surprised you. So, if you look at moving from one, you speak about tiers, one tier to another, or one problem to another. Where did you see any kind of almost a vicious circle? We're doing more of one creates more of something else, which then in turn feeds back to that, the previous one.
I can jump in here, actually. I think it's probably helpful because we answered that question about talent issues. When you get into the issue of staff shortages, the problem is there's this feeling of, if there's not enough equipment, there's a material shortage, and that leads to a lack of trust between the patient and the provider. And then so what that does is it actually leads to a staffing shortage, because then you have people who feel that they're not respected by the community. The nurses feel like they're not actually giving the care that the community deserves. And so it kind of perpetuates this almost circle where if there's not enough equipment, there's a lack of trust, and then staffing shortages, and then you lead to this whole issue of health system overload because there's not enough people in the actual communities performing the work that needs to be done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to Amit Fable. You have done an incredible job, and it's really nice to hear from you and see your presentation. And thank you to the judges for those questions. Last on our agenda, but certainly not least, we have our team, The Gamers, consisting of Robin, Ben and Raymond, Lawrence and Douglas. And their project is called Snakes and Barriers, addressing the imbalance in the representation of African culture in the global video gaming industry. I can see Lawrence is sharing his screen. I'm just going to wait for that to come through. Yep, it's come through. And the presentation mode there is going to come up now. Is everyone ready?
All right, I am ready on my end. Is Ben around?
Yep, ready.
Okay.
Fantastic. I'm going to count you guys in, and 3, 2, 1, go for it.
Good evening. I'm Benon Maguta, and together with my partner Lawrence Nyati, we're going to be presenting our topic centered around developing the South African video game industry. Now, most of us have played video games at some point, whether it's on your mobile phone or on your computer. But how many of us have played African-themed games? Games that tell African stories, games that are representative, and games that do not hypersexualize or over-sexualize women. See, most South Africans still view video games as a distraction, when in reality, games inspire, games develop problem-solving skills, and games can be a solution to our current unemployment crisis. Now, all this cannot be achieved if we have an industry that is extremely exclusive and biased in terms of who gets access to video games and who gets to develop video games in South Africa. South Africa has the largest video game market in Africa, accounting for over $315 billion of the global market share in 2020, but a high developer failure rate means this was largely due to consumers and had very little to do with South African video game developers. Our local industry is dominated by private equity funding, mostly bootstrapping, and this has contributed towards a racially and gender biased industry. Now, to help develop the full picture, the global video game industry was worth more than $159 billion in 2020. This amount is projected to almost double by 2025, and Africa, the second largest continent in the world, only accounted for less than 3% of this. $159 billion is a huge number, but to help put things into perspective, the global video game industry is bigger than the global box office, European soccer, the global music industry, and the NFL combined. But our problems still stand. Video games are seldom African themed. Our industry has a lot of biases, and we still view video games as a distraction. Lawrence will now take you through a detailed breakdown of how we went about mapping out our problem.
To understand our problem, we broke it down into 5 silos specifically. One on the finance side, the other on the public sector, the other in sustainability, skills, and the gray silo. Now, all these silos really speak to each other when developing solutions. The gray silo in particular was of interest as it provided us with a system boundary to understand the mechanics behind the problem that we just expressed. We saw that there is a need for agility and productivity in education that can be built through gaming. We also saw that we can also address and sensitize the community on racial aspects and gender inclusivity through gaming as well. We also saw that we can nurture and develop investment decision making through games, and a good example for that would be Monopoly. To understand this problem, we view it from an events perspective, which we tend to react mostly. This is what we see on a daily basis and react to. Underlying those events, we have certain patterns that allow us to anticipate particular events happening simply because the pattern is happening. And driving those patterns are certain structures that exist explicitly and implicitly, and we can actually deal with those from a design level. To change those structures, it emanates from a mentality side where we need actual transformation if we're going to change the mentality. And what anchors everything above is the vision, which really drives the innovation that we expect in any sector that we have. So what do we see? We see a lot of instances where there are very few South African games in stores, and this is highlighted by a mere 38% penetration rate in the South African market of South African content. That means most of it is externally developed. We also see a lot of poor game quality with minimal engagement abilities. We have a lot of failed game studios that we see in South Africa, mostly emanating from the fact that the average user spend per game is around $13 annually per individual. We see very little Black and women involvement in this particular sector, with about a maximum of 10% of the characters identifying as Black, and at least maximum 2% Black individuals are identifying as Black from the development side. So what patterns do we see? What we see a lot of location-oriented gaming, with Cape Town and Johannesburg and a little bit of Pretoria dominating in South Africa. There is also a slow penetration rate of the internet in South Africa. In 2020, Limpopo only has about 1.6% of households that have a home connection to the internet. We have seen a gradual reduction in the flow of capital that will be used in this particular industry, stepping down from about 5.9% in the early 2000s to just under 1% in 2020. There has also been a widening economic gap, further minimizing the potential of the market that could be realized in this space. So structures that exist within our communities, whether implicit or explicit, we have cultural, gender, and racial bias structures that exist. And a good example is women must know their place. Furthermore, we have financial and economic exclusion structures that exist. And one of the issues that come across here is the issue of having collateral when accessing financing. We also have infrastructure and educational mismatch that exists, and this usually takes out or removes the rural population completely from being involved in innovative industries and taking the development of the country further. So from a mentality perspective, what we've seen a lot with the people is that there is a certain level of inferiority complex that exists, and it forces people to undermine their thoughts and look down upon themselves. We have a modified capitalism structure that exists in South Africa that we do not fully understand. Are we a communist state? Are we a socialist state? Or are we true capitalism? We also have short-termism in investment, where people want payback periods of less than 3 years, and at the same time forsaking or foregoing the long-term investment attributes that would come from that. There is also a need to reshape the paradigms that exist in our society. So what is the vision going forward? What we want is an inclusive and engaging South African gaming content creation space.
Now, one of the existing solutions we identified was bootstrapping, where developers, with the help of their network, are funding their own video game development businesses. An obvious problem that arises from this is the exclusion of those who cannot afford to make such investments, which is the majority of South Africans in this case. There's also an increase in the number of digital tech-focused business incubators, which assist digital entrepreneurs like game developers with some of the skills and resources required to reduce the probability of failure. An additional existing solution relates to the NPO initiatives that are introducing young people from disadvantaged backgrounds to new technologies, while also working with big corporations to set up computer labs in schools and the likes. We also identified some gaps and levers of change, with the first one being industry research. There is a definite need for continuous industry research and monitoring if we were to ever better understand industry dynamics and measure the effectiveness of solutions implemented. Only a few publications exist, and most of the statistics are derived from small surveys conducted by individuals or small organizations within the industry. There is also an issue around access to consumers. The current consumer market mainly consists of people with access to debit or credit cards. So an alternative digital payment method that is available to all would also increase the number of potential customers available to local developers. Esports for everyone. Electronic gaming competitions are on the rise, but that is largely due to those who can afford the hardware and the software requirements. We can leverage some of the facilities being developed by these NPOs by introducing a gaming component to their curriculums that is both
2 minutes remaining.
That is both recreational and competitive, while adopting an incentivized learning approach that would be used to attract members to their original programs also. The last gate relates to gaming incubators and accelerators. These are incubators that are solely focused on gaming and have a greater impact, since most of the aspects will be tailored for gamers or game developers. That's in terms of office or studio setups, the workshops, and the actual training programs.
So to address the impact gaps that we saw, we developed a holistic solution approach, particularly anchored on inclusive skills development in South Africa. So what this entails is there is a need for people to learn with purpose. There is a need to incorporate computer-aided learning. There is a need for cultural sensitivity. And overall, this would imply destigmatizing the aspect of gaming as a country and realizing that gaming can actually contribute to actually addressing some of the major issues that we experience in this particular country. The public sector could also play a pivotal role in determining and building the relevant regulatory to protect people in this space and developing oriented sectors that could assist in the development of skills. There is a need for the public sector to work with the finance sector to develop revolving funds as well as structured transaction methods that will allow existing gaming infrastructure to fund future gaming infrastructure and thereby giving enough leverage so that there is development in that particular sector. We can work with accelerators to develop the market and give access to the markets to all those that are developing, and use some other financial instruments such as the Section 12J to ensure that funds are available for that. To wrap it all up, there is a need for sustainability from both an enterprise supplier development way as well as intensive and extensive plowback across all industries to ensure that there is development of that particular sector. And from that, it's a thank you from me and the team, and we believe this puts South Africa at a better position to be better prepared for the new AfCFTA agreement and enter the African space with the gaming industry.
Thank you so much, guys. That you also stuck to time wonderfully. That was awesome. And thank you for your presentation. I'm going to open it up to the judges and start our 5 minutes for questions. If any of the judges can raise their hand and ask a question, and I'll call you up to go ahead. Zach, you can go for it.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and such an interesting problem to unpack. You mentioned quite specifically at the end, there's this big divide between who can access video games in South Africa. And I started to find out from you, where would you practically start addressing that issue? And how do you do it cheaply enough to make it accessible to everyone?
I'm sorry, I did not get the last part of the question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. Just how could you make it accessible enough to everyone if there's even just basic ICT services are lacking in South Africa?
All right, that's actually a very interesting question, and I think it falls to one of the major gray areas we spoke about, such that there is a need for us to do an in-depth understanding. However, a good approach that would allow for risk sharing between entities that already exist and those that are upcoming was once again finding ways and means to use the resources that have already been developed by current players in the industry, such that they can invest in the future and upcoming developers in that particular space. And what that allows us is to have capital that is available to grow outwards, in this case, from the cities towards the rural area, but the cost will be a least cost approach as compared to trying to develop all that infrastructure from a commercial banking perspective with higher interest rates and all that. So building in equity into the industry and using current people to invest in equity in that particular industry would be the most affordable and cost-effective approach to actually ensuring that there is development of this particular sector. And once again, as Bennett also mentioned, there is a lot of corporate social initiatives that are happening currently in the light of building computer centers, building schools, etc. We can also piggyback on that and build in a gaming component into that and leverage the infrastructure that they have laid down and hopefully grow from there and implement the solution further.
Thank you so much for that. Any other questions from the judges?
Yeah, I'd just be interested to find out, in your write-up, you guys obviously noted that gaming skills development isn't part of the critical skills framework in South Africa. Do you guys believe that it should be?
Right, thanks for that. So we do not believe it should be, it must be, simply because the arms of the gaming space actually reach further than most of the traditional critical skills that we'll look at. So if you take, for instance, engineering, it reaches the design and implementation of particular projects. However, gaming on its own appeals to the younger folk, the students that are still at school, the people that are at university, and even those that have gone beyond university. So if there is a message that can be packaged well and put together, then you have a situation where games can in fact have a significant impact in society by delivering the message that is incorporated in them in a fun way rather than focusing on the traditional aspect. So it's not a matter of should be, however, it's a matter of they must be, so that it can enable a proper drive and see that we can implement that there is a longer reach that we can reach using games, particularly as they can also be delivered through mobile phone devices. So that is something that is really sort of almost available at a rural context side of things. So it must be a critical skill that is included within the policy framework of the country, and it must be, for the lack of better words, taken seriously.
So just to add, games incorporate coding, AI, machine learning. So even if we don't add gaming explicitly as like video games, but some of the tools that we learn, we can teach young people like AI and machine learning that are musts. With the final product being gaming, it can also assist us in teaching those skills like coding, machine learning, and AI, but not necessarily as like gaming is a curriculum, but the tools that you can learn can lead you to be a video game developer.
Fantastic, thank you. And we have time for just one more question from Shanaz. Go for it.
So I'll try to make this quick. I just am quite interested in this idea that gaming opens up the potential to tell different types of stories that wouldn't necessarily have come to the fore or in a different medium. And you're talking about bridging divides, but storytelling is such a rich culture within the country. And so I just wanted to like, if you can share a bit of thought around how would you target, for example, women in communities or in their homes that are telling stories anyways, and convince them to take up this idea? Because it's one thing to almost, convince the structures, but what about the youth or the women or the men that you want must either develop the games or play the games? Yeah. So those are
All right, that's quite interesting. And once again, that would be a multifaceted problem. However, approaching it from a cost-effective way, what we have seen in recent years, really in South Africa, has been the emergence of NPO organizations really that are appealing to different structures and different levels of our communities. You've got those focused on women, those focused on the girl child, the boy child, etc. And I think the first port of call with regards to it being cost effective and the availability of resources would be to find a way to work with those particular NPOs to sort of develop an infrastructure or a medium that allows the people or the end users of their programs to actually have access to this new way of thinking, which is, in this case, we could call it gaming. And once that has been developed and established, only then can we start working on a relationship where those people that are keen on understanding what this is all about can then be developed further, and their stories can be harnessed, and we then go on to develop skills that would actually give them the capacity to translate their stories from, say, words in this case, to it being something that is graphic and presented to quite a number of people. And one of the major challenges.
Lawrence, I'm gonna have to cut you off there. Can you wrap up your sentence? Sorry, we've just run out of time.
Oh, okay. One of the major challenges will then now be how best can you take that package solution, which is coming from multiple sources, and try and disseminate that to the rest of the country. So that is where the cultural sensitivity aspect would then now come in, working together with the Department of Culture and traditional items, so that at least we can disseminate that information and it spans across multiple cultures in the country.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lawrence. And thank you to our judges there. That brings, and thank you to this team. This was a really, really great presentation. So that brings to the end of our presentations. The 4 teams have done a phenomenal job. What's going to happen now is two things. The judges are going to leave the call and join their own room, where they'll deliberate with their scorecards, as well as they have a discussion on who the winning team will be. And we'll also have a vote now for the audience favorite. Just to note that the audience favorite cannot also be the winning team. So we'll, Kenzie and I will be collaborating there. So you'll see the poll has come up there. We'd love for the audience to engage and vote on your favorite team. The judges, please meet me in the other room, and we will see you there now. Kenzie, over to you.
Thanks, Rowan. I think we'll give the participants and everybody just a few more seconds to actually vote. Precious is doing all the technical bits in the background. So I see that there's a timer. So Precious, maybe you could just give me an indicator, maybe once we get to 50 seconds, or I see 77 people have completed the poll. I think if we can get as close as we can get to like 90 or 100%, that would be ideal. Okay, we're at 83. I'll give it a few more seconds for people who haven't voted. Okay, we're approaching 90. So vote for the team that you thought gave a really good presentation and that you'd like to see win. Okay, great. So I think we're done with the actual poll. Thank you so much, Precious, for that. That's very useful. So what's going to happen next, as Roy mentioned, is that the judges are off deliberating in a separate room, and we're now joined by our guest speaker, Lauren Hermanes, who's basically going to be chatting to us about systems thinking and power, and she's going to be chatting to us for about 20 minutes. So I'm going to introduce Lauren now. So Lauren is the founder and director of How We Adapt. Lauren has 10 years of experience in sustainable development research and practice. During her career, she's worked in the private and public sectors, academia, and with NGOs focusing on sustainable energy innovation, urban resilience, and green economic development. Lauren has an academic background in complexity and systems thinking, with a Master of Arts in Philosophy and Development and a Master of Philosophy in Development Policy and Practice. And she's also recently enrolled for a PhD at the University of Cape Town. Lauren, welcome to the 2021 UCT Map the System semifinals. We're really looking forward to your presentation. And I know that when we were engaging with the different teams, we had workshops in February and in March, and there were so many issues that came up around power. So we thought you'd really be an amazing speaker to touch on those points and maybe just add a different perspective for the audience and for the participants. Lauren, I hand over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you for that kind introduction. I am not going to be using a PowerPoint. I think we've all been spending much too much time looking at PowerPoints on Zoom. So I am, as has been said, just going to chat about some of my ideas about systems thinking, complexity thinking. So I just want to check if this microphone is working. If someone could just confirm that for me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. I have been having some issues. Okay, cool. So the purpose of this challenge, which brings us all together, and at which I've been asked to address everyone, albeit remotely, is to bring together not only people, but also bold ideas to transform the multiple systems in which we experience interrelated social and ecological problems, enduring and pervasive challenges, which are distributed unevenly across the world and its populations, brought about through layered historical processes, cleaving, deepening, and reinforcing unequal and inequitable distributions of power and resources. This is the context in which systems thinking has been proffered as a new and exciting toolkit to solve those seemingly intractable problems such as poverty, climate change, sustainable local livelihoods, etc., those that have been addressed here this evening as well, that have eluded the best and most ambitious development plans to date. In response to increasing evidence of the negative consequences of disregarding interrelation and uncertainty in our understandings and engagement in social and ecological systems, growing numbers of practitioners are being drawn to the frameworks and methods broadly gathered under the label systems thinking or complexity thinking. There are various approaches that conceptualize social and ecological phenomena as complex systems, aiming to model and understand these things that frustrate our analytical problem-solving methods. Over the past decade, systems and complexity thinking has moved from the fringes into the mainstream of development policy and practice. We are all speaking the language now, and it is applied in international frameworks such as the Sustainable Development Goals, which sets the cascading agenda for major policy work and investment up to 2030. So let's just remind ourselves, what is this thing, system, that we are thinking? According to Danella Meadows, a system is a set of things, people, cells, molecules, whatever, interconnected in such a way that they produce their own pattern of behavior over time. We who are, in whatever way, on whatever scale, aiming to solve the large and small societal problems of our time within this framework are engaged in practices of systems change, which, according to the School of Systems Change, includes both processes and outcomes intervening in these dynamic sets with different identities and patterns of behavior when viewed at different scales. Terms like adaptive development, anticipatory systems are now commonplace across fields. We are all familiar with frameworks and tools such as systems mapping, causal loop diagrams, and resilience thinking. Systems thinking is then often positioned as a distinct and new way of knowing to improve our development or social innovation strategies, as well as their results. Now, one of the main motivations for this claim of improvement of both practice and impact is the fact that systems thinking confronts and deals with complexity better than other analytical approaches that tend to disregard the significance of relationships and relationality in the things that we try to understand. While this may be true, many mainstream approaches that claim to deal with complexity, that purport to do so, including most systems practices, gloss over some of the most important and critical insights and emphases that have come from careful studies of complexity. Many important voices in these debates, such as Dave Snowden, emphasize that complexity-based approaches are not and should not be viewed merely as new strategies, but are fundamentally attuning us not to what we do know, not to what we can know, but to what we do not and cannot know about the systems that we seek to change. Flowing from this sensitivity to not knowing, these critical complexity authors propose that we develop careful and humble relationships to both the systems in which we seek to intervene and the tools that we use in this process. As put by Edgar Morin, complexity, not complex systems, but complexity will first manifest itself for this observer in the form of obscurity, doubts, ambiguity, and even paradox and contradiction. Complexity is not a toolkit. Complexity is not systems thinking. Complexity is reality woven together. He continues, complexity asserts itself, first of all, as the impossibility to simplify. It arises where complex unity produces its emergences, where distinctions and clarities in identity and causality are lost, where disorder and uncertainty disturb phenomena, where the subject and observer surprises his own face in the objects of observation, where antinomies make the course of reasoning go astray. One shouldn't try to use big words so late in the day. So cultivating, I argue, an intimacy with the complexity of systems we seek to change is not in the first place about hacking away through a wicked problem. It is not about quick fixes and incrementalism and rapid failure and failing forward. It is rather, in the first place, a confrontation with this radical uncertainty, with not knowing what to do and how we may proceed. It is a moment of reckoning with the limits of our knowledge and practice that opens the possibility of a less bombastic, a less violent, and a more responsible engagement with the world that we so urgently would like to change. This is the antidote to the certainty that emboldens orthodoxy, whether this be macroeconomic approaches, expectations for infrastructure build-outs, or new methods of upgrading urban slums. We cannot work well in these contexts without first understanding the limits to what we know, to what we understand, and what we can see of those systems in which we work. And also, the people or non-human organisms, communities, and systems that will carry the risk and bear the cost of our misapprehensions. At the heart of complexity, then, sits a paradox that every seeker of systemic transformation confronts either willingly or unwillingly, consciously or unconsciously. We know that we cannot know complex systems in their complexity, and therefore we must simplify these systems in order to understand them. And at the same time, we know that if we simplify complex systems, we will necessarily leave out aspects of the very thing that we seek to understand, which means that there is error always in our assessment to a degree which we can never fully anticipate and account for. Our complex system and systems tools are abstractions. They are maps that help us to navigate vast territories that exist and live and change with no regard for our static postulations. And like all maps, they are deeply political. They are intractably marked with the makings and operations of power. What truly does it mean to work for or work with potential beneficiaries of a systems change intervention? This is a critical and recurrent question that systems change practitioners must integrate into our own self-reflection and self-evaluations. When we extend our understanding of relationality within complex systems to include ourselves in relation to those systems that we seek to change, we must confront the power dynamics that enable and constrain us as individuals, observers, and intervening agents within these systems. We must confront also the power dynamics that legitimate certain ways of knowing and others not, that render certain aspects of social ecological systems visible and others invisible. Although now familiar in many socially oriented disciplines and transdisciplinary endeavors, it is still important to note that the language and concepts of the theories of complex systems and systems theories and systems thinking have their roots in natural sciences. These concepts have been translated from natural into social context and used as metaphors for explaining some of the disorderliness, the dense connectivity, or unpredictability of systems that include people and social institutions. However, these tools stand outside of social scientific traditions and histories of resistance and of struggle that have fought the quote-unquote system, that have had to survive the uses of power that have marginalized, exploited, and mutilated. It is incumbent upon proponents of systems thinking and practice to understand how these tools that we use fit into a longer history of problem solving and social critique. It is necessary for us to understand that applying the metaphor of an organism to a city, for example, does not and cannot erase the operations of identity, of power, of race and ethnicity, for example, of gender and sexuality within that system. Systems practice, if it is to represent a step forward in development and social innovation, if it is to have any emancipatory potential, must contend with its own situatedness and be open to critique and reflection always. The opening for this criticality we find then in this familiarity, this friendliness even, with our individual and collective ignorance, to which complexity points us. This could perhaps lead one, this feeling of not knowing, to a sense of inertia or stagnation or even paralysis, as no solution that we put forward perfectly responds to the problems at hand. Inertia, however, is not an option. Here we confront the second and perhaps most important paradox for those of us working on systems change. When we accept that we cannot calculate a way forward, then and only then is it possible to decide on the way forward. Understanding that we cannot transfer responsibility within a complex system for a policy or an innovation to the outcomes of research processes or a modeling exercise means that we must then delve into the very important work of deciding what matters, of making the impossibly difficult trade-offs, and of orienting our decisions not only in what we know of the present, but also what we value and why, and what we want for the future. Speculative reasoning, imagination, and creativity are as important to the systems thinking toolkit as maps and models and experiments. The experience of complexity can be an experience that overwhelms, or we can see it as an invitation to participate fully and responsibly in the world. All social structures emerge, if we take complexity seriously, out of asymmetric, dynamic relations, because complex systems are not flat, are not static, and are not homogeneous. Even our best efforts at technocratic solutions will always create winners and losers along the way. Therefore, whatever we do, wherever we are, wherever we choose to intervene in these systems for their betterment and improvement, what we do, how we do it, who we are, is always already deeply and profoundly political. We must decide if we want to reinforce the politics of the powerful or use our systems tools to imagine and create a world that is kinder, a world that is less violent, and a world in which it is a matter of intellectual and ethical integrity to be firmly committed to the idea that things could always be radically different to what we understand them to be, and radically different to what is currently the case. That's it.
Wow, thank you so much for that presentation, Lauren. I was actually tweeting at the same time, and there's so many amazing nuggets, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't tweet fast enough. So what I'm going to do now is open up and ask the audience if they have any questions. I'm just looking at the chat box if anybody has a question. And Mulapo Jonathan, I see that you have a question, so I'm going to unmute you and ask you to just maybe expand a little bit on what you shared and your question. Go ahead, Molapo.
Right. Hi, Kente. Hi, Lauren.
Hi.
I heard a lot of big words and very inspiring thought leadership from the presenter and yourself, Lauren. So my question is really around the 67% failure rate in our strategy execution globally. I'm not sure if you're aware of this. So what I would like to hear from you as an academic / professional, how far are we from the ideal of introducing strategy ontology meta models in our curriculums, early in the curriculums and in institution of higher learning, to manage the complexities that you were alluding to earlier, to reduce strategy execution failures? Slightly long-winded, but I can repeat myself.
Okay, so well, how about I repeat what I think you said, and you tell me if I'm right. Okay.
Please do.
So, okay, all right. So we have this failure of strategy. We have the idea that we're very good at coming up with strategies. When it comes to implementation and assessing impact, we do very, very badly. So 67%, okay, fine, perhaps,
yeah.
But perhaps much more, who knows?
I'm being polite. It's Wednesday, yeah.
Yeah, we still have 2 more days to survive until the weekend. Okay, and then you bring up this idea of ontology meta models. Okay, so I'm not sure exactly what you mean there, but I'm going to say perhaps we can gather under ontological models and epistemological models and axiological models. We can really talk about critical thinking. So to what extent are we really empowered to interrogate our sense making?
Correct.
Right? Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, there's 2 answers to this question. My optimistic answer to this question is that everybody in the world, whether they like it or not, engages with complexity all the time.
Correct.
And whether we do this in our relationships, in our familial relationships, in our work relationships, we do this when you decide of a morning that you would like to start your day with a croissant. It involves engaging with a whole bunch of really layered, interrelated, complex systems, monetary systems, economic systems, infrastructural systems, urban systems, etc. And we engage hugely adeptly in navigating that complexity, and we adjust our behavior along the way, responding to whatever uncertainties may arise, whatever unexpected variables may crop up. We adjust, right? And we generally tend to do pretty well, right? In that. Now, when it comes to scaling up from our individual circumstance and solving problems for the world out there, we tend to lose some sensitivity, to the mess of life. Yeah.
Agreed.
And that, I think, is the source of our failure. Now, how good are we at incorporating frameworks or approaches into our curricula, whether at a primary school level or tertiary education level, that attune us to the kind of epistemological leaps and our assumptions? I think very bad. We're very bad at that.
Right.
So I think we actually have a huge capacity and capability to navigate complexity, and we tend actually through our education system to give some tools that are very useful for understanding the world, but also dismantle that capability, to some extent, that actually dull our attentiveness to uncertainty. And I think that is a massive problem. And we're starting to confront that problem, but we don't, I don't know how systematic that confrontation sort of is, I don't know how successful it is. And I think that's because actually it's not just an intellectual process. it's an existential project. You know, being okay with uncertainty and being okay
Agreed.
with not knowing it's every facet of your humanness, of your human being is engaged in that process. It's not comfortable, it's not nice, right? It's a discomforting process.
Yeah.
So the answer is we're really bad at it. And there are so many scholars and writers and thinkers and painters and dancers who are trying to help us be better, but we don't seem to be very enthusiastic about incorporating those discomforting practices into our strategic arenas where we try to be very serious and in the process can also be very stupid.
Right. Sorry, Kent, I didn't mean to take this much time in get into the bottom of this question. It has been bothering me in the last 10 years, but yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Lauren, for your answer.
Thank you, Malapo.
I think maybe we'll give an opportunity for one more question. I don't know if anybody from the audience had an additional question. I don't see any hands up in my panelist box, but maybe one more question, Lauren, before we let you go, is something that had been raised by a number of participants, you know, in the workshops, in our conversations, in our engagements, and it was something that you said in your talk about the confrontation piece, and how we have to confront these complex problems and how we show up and who we are. And something that we constantly come back to is, well, this feels like such a big problem, and I feel so powerless when I'm confronting, whether it's health, education, whatever it may be. In the work that you've done, what are some of the strategies that perhaps you've leaned on, or maybe just nuggets that you can share with the teams today who have really just started, you know, chipping at the block of some of the issues that they're looking at?
Yeah, I think as a systems practitioner or someone, I don't know, like, I don't really know what to call myself. That's why my introduction is always so long, because I don't have a job title. But I think, you know, it's really important that you see your whole life as your practice. It's kind of a daunting thing, but you have to see all your dinners and all your relationships and all your interactions with the world as places where you get to try out your ideas and try them on like clothing and try them out in more serious ways, you know. Truly, to embrace complexity is not something that you can only do on a project. It's something that if you want to really develop a kind of attentiveness to complexity and a sensitivity to uncertainty, it's something that you have to integrate into the way you think and your world view, and then how you act, you know, which follows from what you believe, right? Whether you know that or not consciously. So that's the one thing I think, which is really great, because then when you go out for dinner with your friends, you can say, well, it's work. And it really is work, you know. It's cultivating an ethical and intellectual societal practice, which is very important. And then, you know, that sort of brings me to my second point, which is that one must cultivate the capacity for collective reasoning and collective sense making. And this means very consciously building up both a kind of an intellectual community, and one can do this not only with actual people, but with, you know, choosing for yourself a few intellectual lineages that you will really go deep into, right? So this is perhaps the bias of someone who like loves philosophy, but one has to really commit to struggle with ideas. If you can just embrace an idea very superficially and it makes you feel very happy, and there's no moment at which it causes you to shake and think about your life and what you've done and how you live and how you think and how you value the world, then truly you do not know that idea. So embracing that struggle with, you know, in your engagement with your intellectual forebears is really critical. And then bringing that sensibility into the construction of community, community of practice where people are doing the same work as you, perhaps differently, hopefully also differently, but also people who just don't know anything about the systems in which you're working and who can provide for you alternative perspectives and critical perspectives. This is really the key, you know, and if you're unwilling to do that work, then you are a danger to yourself and to others in systems change, and you must find something else to do. But if you are willing to do that work, you know, it can be incredibly rewarding, deeply rewarding work, even when it's really difficult, even when it fails, which inevitably it will at some points. But yeah, I mean, it just is such a privilege to find yourself positioned, you know, working, having a career that is so intellectually rich, but at the same time, you know, anchored and oriented around such a dazzling and perhaps ambitious ethical commitment for change as well.
Thanks, Lauren. As you were speaking, make systems thinking almost sound romantic.
Completely. I'm a huge fan of Audre Lorde, and we must all have, you know, reintroduced the erotic and the romantic into life broadly and reject this weird little classification and boxed off, you know, paltry version that we've been offered. Yeah.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I think you shared a lot of amazing nuggets with us. As I was saying, I couldn't tweet fast enough. So that's wonderful. Thank you for joining us. We really loved having you. So now we've reached the final, amazing, the final segment of our evening today. So thank you for sticking with us. We're just past the 2-hour mark and we're hurtling right towards the end. So what's going to happen now is that I'm going to announce the audience award, and then I'm going to hand over to Rowan, who's been, you know, deliberating with the judges to announce the 2021 UCT semi-finalists who will go on to represent UCT at the global finals. And I just want to say before we announce that, having walked this journey with the teams that started with us, that, you know, this isn't the end of having started on this journey with us. I think the tools, the frameworks, the conversations, the community that we've built here, as Lauren was saying, is building and building on that, and almost not necessarily seeing this as the end, but actually seeing it as the beginning of doing really exciting work. Within the Bertha Center, we have a whole community from Bertha scholars, from change makers, who are constantly thinking about these ideas, whether it's from a systems lens or just thinking about how to create social impact. So you're really surrounded amongst, I think, like-minded people. So we really hope that this is the beginning of your journey in whatever career you pursue, whatever work you continue to do at UCT and beyond. That systems thinking is just always sitting in your back pocket. So let me stop there, because I know we're all sitting on the edge of our seats, waiting to find out the results from this evening. So in terms of the audience award, thank you to everybody who voted from the audience. The team that has won that award is Team 2, who are the Disruptors, and that is Delisha Govender, Deboho Maneli, and Michaela Peters. So well done to Team 2 for winning the audience award. That also comes with a small 2,500 Rand voucher to advance the work that you guys are doing. And we're really, I loved your presentation. I loved the effort, and I loved what you put into it. It was so wonderful to see that up on screen this evening. So I'm going to give maybe one of your team members just a quick opportunity, maybe just to reflect on that and share anything that you'd like to share with the audience before I hand over to Rowan.
Thanks. I'm going to ask one of my team members, maybe Teboho, just to share thanks and reflection. I think I spoke a lot in the presentation. Yeah, thank you. Teboho, if you can. if she's available. I don't know. No, maybe not. Okay, that's right. Right now, thank you so much. It was an awesome opportunity and experience. It was great learning how to collaborate and just seeing things through a different lens. I think we all challenged ourselves a lot through the process. Yeah, but just thank you to all of you for the platform, the process, and just the networking, the idea exchange. It was awesome. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Delisha. And I'm going to hand over to Rowan.
Whew. Thanks so much, Ketse. And also, Lauren, I only got the last bits of the Q&A there, but I'm really excited to go back to the recording here and listen to your guest talk. So I've been in a room with the judges who have been deliberating, and I just want to quickly just share before we dive in the marking process, just so everyone's aware of what this is, what the different components are. As soon as I've announced the winner, there's going to be some brief feedback from Dedisa, and then Kente will wrap up at the end for us. So just on, so obviously this process started back in October with registrations. Registrations closed in January, and they've been the last 3 months or so for participants to submit their projects. The evaluation is done in 3 key areas across 11 categories. So the 3 key areas that we look at, or the judges have looked at here, the first one is the submission evaluation. So the participants submitted a map, a summary of their research and bibliography. So the submission evaluation was one component. Then the verbal presentation component was the next area, and that we were looking at the content, the delivery, and the Q&A. And then the third category that we were looking at was the overall evaluation that looked at the application of systems thinking, understanding the challenge, understanding the solutions in the landscape, understanding the gaps and levers of change, and sharing key lessons and insights that were learned. Sorry. And so the judges have been scoring this. They've been across 11 categories. The 5 judges have scored this. So for every single person, there are 50, every single team, sorry, there were 55 inputs into your score. And so it's been really cool to see how these marks come together. And I'll be sharing feedback directly with the teams. The judges really were impressed by all of the different teams that were here. And there were some really, really close individual category or individual column feedback. But without further ado, the top team got the top mark across all 3 categories. So they got the top mark for the submission, they got the top mark for the verbal presentation, and they got the top mark for the overall evaluation. And so I'd like to announce the winner of Map the System 2021, the regional finals at the University of Cape Town, is Team 4, The Gamers. Well done, team. I'd like to welcome any of you to come forward, and yeah, you can give a little round of applause there. I feel like it's very quiet. There we go.
That's what I'm talking about,
Well done. If you'd like to come forward and just some of you just to say a few words if you'd like to.
I don't know if our other partners, Raymond and Robin, are here. Let me just check, but I'm sure there are a few words.
We're here.
Would you like to share any words, Benin?
No, I'm just overexcited, man. I'm very excited. I think it also helps that this is a project that we're looking to develop further. We're in the late stages of developing a gaming accelerator program. And yeah, I'm just excited.
That is wonderful. Anyone else from the team?
We're very excited. Thank you so much to the Betha team, Ben and Lawrence. You guys did an exceptional job presenting. We're really, really proud of you, and we thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Well done, team. And honestly, it was phenomenal. We really enjoyed it. And especially, I mean, I'm a part-time gamer, and it was really cool to see a topic like that in our competition this year. So well done. You'll be receiving 10,000 Rand to continue your work, as well as participating in the global final in Oxford. And you'll be receiving some support from the Bertha Centre to further refine your presentation and get it all up to that global level, which is super exciting. I'm going to leave a couple of minutes now just for Nadisa to share some brief feedback for each of the teams, but I'll also be sharing your scorecards and your final marks to you as well in the next couple of days. So Nadisa, could you come forward? There you are.
Thanks, Rowan. Hi, everyone. Congratulations to those who won, but to all of you. You all presented with passion and a dedication that was really exemplary. By way of an overall piece of feedback to all of you, it's just a reminder as well that the competition is called Map the System, right? The idea is less about the pitch, it's less about the solution and more about applying the frameworks in order to surface the dynamics that are at play beneath the surface of the system you're wanting to nudge at. So this is feedback that we actually give every year because we do tend to focus a little bit more on the pitch. But then just a bit of detailed feedback, not too much. Just hopefully a one-liner on each team. So team one, it's a great presentation. The opening question, I really loved it because it located us all in the system immediately, implicated us in the system. And you know, the leverage point that you identified around twinning, also a really compelling idea, especially as it's talking about, you know, unlikely partnerships between two actors that might occupy different power dynamics, which is great for a systems engagement. The caution from the judges was that you are engaging in a deeply complex context. We know the South African, at least the Cape Town context, to be very, very deeply and very complex and difficult to navigate. So our encouragement is that you really kind of go back and really that you mulch in those intangibles that are getting in the way of what it is that you want to do, which is inclusion. And that opening question that you presented to us is a very good kind of guiding point for your process as well. You know, team two, a lot of passion with you as well. The encouragement as well is to lean into those. You know, you presented the iceberg model, and that was a good one to present with. We encourage you to lean into that, to find more of the patterns, more of the structures, more of the stuff, again, the dynamics that are working and how they relate to each other. I think that would really elevate the work. Similarly with team three, we really enjoyed your systems map, and as it came up in the questions and answers, it felt like the relationships between the different problems that you identified, or not problems, but variables that you identified, how they play on each other, again, would really be wonderful in your preparation as you take the work further. And then finally with team four, the main one piece of feedback we as judges agreed on unanimously was that you led with a very compelling question. And you gave a very strong written submission, very strong presentation, but we felt that compelling question somewhere got lost. So again, especially as you prepare the work more, we really encourage you to go back and have that question guide your work a bit more deliberately. But yeah, obviously the feedback that we gave as a collective will be shared with you by Rowan, as he said. But well done to all of you.
Kense, go for it.
Thanks, Nadisa. That was wonderful. Thanks for the judges again. Thanks for the time that you guys took to go through those submissions. This is all voluntary, so we really appreciate the time that you set aside for us. So yeah, that was amazing, and thank you for that. And I think maybe the last group that I have to thank, and I'd be remiss if I didn't thank everybody who was involved in making sure that this event is possible. So I want to start with Precious. She's been doing the tech in the background and helping all our panelists and our teams make sure that all their presentations work. And yeah, so thank you, Precious. We appreciate that. Grant, who's also part of our marketing team, has been tweeting like mad in the background, sharing all of your slides, sharing all your presentations. So that's been wonderful. So thank you for that, Grant. I know you've also been doing a lot of other work, just making sure that in the run up to this event, it actually is a success. So thank you for that. I think lastly, I have to thank Rowan. We've been marching on this journey since late last year, and it's been an absolutely wonderful partnership. And yeah, I hope that 2022 is just as exciting and just as an amazing whirlwind. And then I have to thank the teams. attending the workshops, making the submissions. I think every time I left a workshop, I was more inspired by yourselves, by the work that you're trying to do. I think having people like you thinking about the kind of problems and challenges that you're thinking about just makes me really, really inspired for the kind of futures that we are walking into. So yeah, absolutely fantastic. So I know all of us have been here for about 2.5 hours now. So I'm gonna actually say, let's bring this event to a close. Thank you so much to everybody who attended. I've been looking at the chat box, looking at all the questions and all the comments. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to the teams. But for now, good night. And you can follow us on all our social media channels for updates on the team that's going to be presenting at the finals. So yeah, that's it for tonight. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Kense. You're amazing.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Kense.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.